conversation and be able to do it regardless of what you say or don't say, without being perceived as aggressive. But Dr. Brown made an excellent point. There are so many resources in 2021 that you can point somebody to. The good Google is your friend if you're really interested in learning how to be a co-conspirator for Black people. And then for Black folk who are engaging in non-Black spaces on these subjects, have your talking points ready to go. If you know you're operating in certain spaces, have your talking points, stick to your talking points, have your facts, because one thing, particularly as a lawyer, we can argue about a whole lot of things, but facts speak for themselves. Have your facts so that when you are having conversation with individuals on these topics, you're doing it from an informed place and not an emotional place, because it's when we go to that emotional place is when people will start to gaslight you into, oh, well, you're angry. No, I'm angry. If your family had lived through what we had lived through in this country, you'd be angry too. And that's just like I say all the time, or my mom used to say, if we as Black people were ever interested in doing to the larger society what was done to us, ironically, we'd be the ones viewed as being angry, but we're not even talking about that. So again, I say, when you're going into these conversations, particularly in the workplace, like I said, it's tricky to have these types of conversations in the workplace unless this is the work that you do. So when you go into those conversations, going armed with facts, going armed with resources, and then also know when enough is enough and when to walk away from those conversations. Because if you're not going to change minds overnight, and there are some people who you're not going to change their minds at all. So you have to know when to protect your peace and your employment and walk away from some of those conversations in the workplace.
Absolutely.
But to that point, I think even some of the political changes are because by 2035, white people will be a numerical minority in this country, and they're getting very nervous that we will treat them the way they treated us when brown people are in the numerical majority within this country. So I think because of that, because of their fear, they're starting to really belt tighten, and I think that's where you're seeing all of the public policy around keeping them within their place.
Absolutely.
They don't want to give up their power. Yeah.
They don't want to give up their power, but guess what? We're coming for it. And that's why I'll just say, as much as I talk about the anxiety that comes from being a boots on the ground activist, I have never lost hope in the last year and a half. In fact, I am more hopeful than I ever have been, because when I see all the work that they're doing to disenfranchise Black voters, I know it's because they know we are coming and we are a force, and particularly Black women. If you look at what Georgia did, I'm not just talking about, turning Georgia blue, but throughout the state, in those local races that happened this year, we were flipping seats. You were seeing young Black women elected as mayors in towns where we are not in the majority. You were seeing DAs winning seats when they were told, sit to the side, it's not your turn. And look at Fannie. So, I say that to say, I see the progress we're making. I see the need to continue to train up a new crop of instigators and agitators to get into that good trouble that John Lewis talked about. So I'm not weary. And I am not tired. I have rested, and I'm ready to get back in the fight. And so I am hopeful as a people that when we take that time out to refresh, relax, and rest, that we can come back in the fight and come back even stronger than we were before, because in 2022, they better get ready for us.
Yeah, so in terms of this, the being refreshed and having faith, we have a question with regards to young activism. How can we energize our young activists with faith and trust in continuing the movement here in America, despite living through the Trump years and Biden's unsuccessful bills?
I mean, I have to tell you, the young activists are energized, y'all. Like, I think, and I say young because I used to think I was young, but now I'm sort of that middle age, right? But when I was moved to tears when I was out there in May and June of 2020, because the kids were out there, y'all. I'm talking about 16, 17, 18, 19, early 20s, students that were in professional schools. We have so many colleges and universities right here in Atlanta, and they were out there, they were organizing. They didn't just go out there to march in the street, or as the news media would have liked to cover. They didn't go out there to loot. They went out there to exercise their right. They were registering voters when they were out there. They were talking about the advancement of certain bills, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, when after he passed away. They were out there talking about these things and educating each other about these things. And so what we need to do as older activists is get out of their way. We have a habit sometimes of thinking that they have to do it the way we did it in order for it to be done right, but they got the numbers out there. And the reality is that hate crime bill in Georgia, we may not have seen it pass when it did, but for those young folk in the middle of a pandemic taking it to the street. The older folk, some of us were out there, but some of us couldn't afford to be out there because of COVID-19. The
Right.
Young people said, let us put this movement on our back. And again, when we talk about the media, and I know we're running up on the end of our time, but that was one of the points I know you wanted to touch on, Nadia. The
Yes.
media had a way throughout that summer of only focusing on this very small minority of individuals who were out there to agitate and cause violence and looting. But what did we start to see with these cell phone cameras? These Black activists were recording white folk out there who were the ones who were looting, who were setting fire to police stations. It was not us. And so again, I think while it may be hard to remain optimistic for those younger voters, what we as older voters and those who have been around for a little longer have to continue to do is, when we see them becoming hopeless, to continue to pour into them, pour resources into them, pour money into them, pour time into them, mentor them in this. And because I'm telling you, they're out there. They're out there and they're already doing an amazing job in terms of, they would get on Instagram and Snapchat and have thousands of people lined up ready to march in the streets in an hour's time. So we just have to continue to teach them how to channel that energy and turn that energy in the streets into advocacy for legislation, advocacy for things such as the Freedom to Vote Act that's pending in Congress, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So, but they're doing an amazing job, and I just continue to look forward to what they're going to do.
Yeah, and I the only thing I would add is just affirming and validating them, and I have honestly, I have several white clients that, will continue to raise DE&I issues in their workspace. And even when that's not where the conversation is, they're always bringing it back. They're always bringing it back to advocacy. And so encouraging them to continue to live that.
Absolutely. And I like the suggestion of channeling that energy in a focused direction. I know we have a couple of questions in the chat that have come up in reference. So really quick, are there any organizations that come to mind where an individual can become involved to be a part of starting good trouble?
Oh yeah, and here in Atlanta area, you have the New Georgia Project. You have the ACLU of Atlanta that was engaged in these organizations. Black Voters Matter Fund. They are boots on the ground. In fact, Latasha Brown, one of the co-founders, talks about these southern states. These aren't red states. These are voter suppressed states down here in the South. So getting with those organizations, you have Sora Helen Butler as the CEO of the Poor People's Agenda. Like there are a number of Poor People's Campaign. There are a number of organizations in this area that are doing really good work. And again, you can Google to get that contact information. Anybody who has any interest, you can always reach out to me as social action chair, social action at asacdst.org if you need any suggestions on organizations that you can recommend for students. And I mean, even organizations such as ASAC's Delta Youth Programs, if we spend at least a month with our students, once a month with our students, talking about ways that they can become advocates and get involved, even from 6th grade on to high school. So there are a number of different organizations in the area that people can connect with.
Sharice, the other thing that's striking to me is every time I go to vote, there's still 72-year-old ladies at the polls. And I think that even if the women on this conversation say, I don't know if I can put another long-term commitment on my plate, I think even a one-off that you'll spend a day helping to get people registered to vote, helping to volunteer at the polls, I think even that is one other thing that we could do. But again, every time I go to the poll, I'm looking at women who look like my grandmother still.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And let's see, let me go to since we're coming down to the wire, our next question that we have that's come up in the chat is related to self-help during this time. Would journaling be helpful when experiencing the anxiety as we are watching how we're being treated on social media and the messaging that's out there and the laws that are being passed that are to certain communities' deficits? Would journaling be helpful? Are there any other ways to best support our coping during this time? And understanding that we're in a space that we will need to continue to be in terms of pushing the agenda of having equity across all cultural groups with regards to our legal rights. Any suggestions as it relates to that?
Yeah, I think the journaling is awesome, but I think the other thing that I often talk to my clients about when it comes to their anxiety is to talk to your anxiety, to really view anxiety as your dashboard, like when the lights are starting to flash and you're starting to signal that there's something wrong, to kind of recognize that and talk to your anxiety, ask it, what is it that you want? What is it that you need? And sometimes it's saying, don't go out and march in the streets. What if we get shot? What if it's all of your fears? So addressing those fears and, acknowledging to yourself that there's some risk. There's some risk in having the conversations with your coworker. There's some risk in going out and being an advocate. There's a risk in standing up for your rights, but also being able to tell your anxiety, I've got this, like I'm not going to be out late while people are looting, or if things start to feel a little bit stressful, I trust myself. I'm going to listen to my instincts. I will leave an environment that doesn't feel comfortable for me. But I think the other thing is, for people who are taking their children with them, getting an assessment of where are we going to be? What are the rules? What am I going to have a conversation with my child about in terms of staying together or whatever? And at the point where I say it's time to go, like listening to your instinct and knowing that it's time to go. And that's knowing what your limits are, being very clear about what is your capacity to contribute. And not all of us can get out there and march, but what's your role, and figuring out what is your lane and holding your lane.
And also I'll add to that, because one thing that was really validating for me was to also get back into reading. So a book that I'm actually reading now, I don't know if you can see it with my background, but it's called Hood Feminism: Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by Mickey Kendall. And it, it really talks about how the modern day feminist movement has a glaring blind spot, and quite frankly, it's Black women. Because the mainstream feminist movement has been focused on basically elevating the plight of few of us. And so sometimes, like when I'm having certain anxiety about certain issues, I'll just go, get lost in a book on the subject, because it validates my experience, right? Like when you're trying to build these coalitions with non-Black activists for various issues, sometimes we encounter this friction and tension between the two. And so journaling, but then also, you know, reading and getting into some of there's so much literature nowadays, not just the, you know, these types of books with scholarly articles, if that's your thing, to really educate yourself, because then when you're armed with more information, you become a better activist. So sometimes it's taking a step back and studying and being informed, so that when you're going into these spaces and these conversations, you know you're doing it in a way that's not going to harm the movement, but going to continue to further the movement in terms of what we're asking for and why we're asking for it.
Yeah, and the last thing I actually wanted to add was just seeking support. So whether that's getting feedback from, you know, family members, friends, you know, sorors, your church community, to make sure that you have those spaces where you're able to talk about how you're feeling and how you're experiencing all of this. Also being clear with people when you are overwhelmed and you don't have capacity to continue to have these conversations. And at the point where the anxiety is not well self-managed, you know, giving some consideration to whether or not you need to seek a therapist, or whether or not you're open to talking to your primary care physician about switching medications or going on a medication. Because I think that's the other thing that we don't always acknowledge, is that, you know, if we haven't had a physical in a while, that your thyroid could be acting up, and that could be the source of your emotional issues. You know, where a lot of us are at a chapter of our lives where our hormones are kind of up and down. That could be the source of our emotional issues. But, you know, there's an acronym that I was using called BLACK. So that's when you're feeling stress or anxiety, is to make sure that you're taking the time to breathe. That most of the time we're walking around taking shallow breaths, that you're taking deep breaths, that you do a body scan and just kind of be aware of where your body is in space. And then also, you know, asking the questions and communicating. When you recognize that, you know, that all of this information is a little bit overwhelming, that it's fine to turn off the television, to stop taking in all of the information, and, you know, to get it in doses. Particularly, you know, Nadia had mentioned earlier, January 6th, like, so many people were consuming that information in real time. At some point, a lot of us needed to step back and just get the cliff notes. Like, we don't all need to read the entire book. And the same thing happened for me during George Floyd's murder, and then also the trials, is I couldn't consume all of that information and still be 100% for my own family and for my clients. So just kind of recognizing, like, I set aside a time at the end of the day when I was willing to kind of check in and get the bullet points, but I did not need the hour by hour, blow by blow details of that man's murder. It just was too much for me.
Yeah, and I think the same is true when we talk about how the media has an impact on us, right? I had to get to a point where I would no longer watch videos of Black people dying at the hands of law enforcement. I made sure I was fully informed, but it's like we've become desensitized to death and murder when we are literally watching people die on camera, on social media, on TV. You know, and it's funny because certain news stations will say, we're blocking out this portion of the video because it's graphic. And so you may get it filtered that way, but then I pick up my cell phone and I'm scrolling through Facebook. And at the time, I also had to turn off that feature where videos would automatically play, because that video of George Floyd being murdered was automatically playing, and it was on. I mean, my entire news feed some days were full of that video, and I just said this was too much, and I had to take a step away for my own mental health. I really did. So yeah, you know, we have to make sure we're filtering what we're seeing, what our children are seeing. You know, it's sad when, you know, you don't want to shelter your children, but you also don't want them to have so much exposure in a way that you can't help them process it, and it's going to create anxiety in them. And so I've had to be more mindful, even when I'm watching certain programming or listening to certain programming. I listen to NPR in the car a lot, right? And there are times when I have to just, okay, my kids are getting in. Let me have a conversation to make sure they understand the context of some of these conversations that are happening. I do want them to be informed. I do want them, if you know them, they're my little mini advocates already. But I have to recognize when it's becoming overwhelming for them.
And we have one more question that came through that actually ties into having conversations with kids, with young adults. The question is, as an educator, K through 12 educator that has to discuss the past with their students, how do you find empowerment in our history, where we as educators don't begin traumatizing our kids with the truth? Is there a way that we, and not just the truth of our history, but the truth of our lives, that this state that we are in, this place where we cannot change our color of our skin. So for our lives, we are in this state of living with a certain level of anxiety when you go out of your house. That becomes a norm, and being able to manage that. But how do we, we're all mothers here. You both have mentioned that you've had to have certain political, racial discussions with your children already. What suggestions would you give to K through 12 educators that feel compelled to tell the truth to their students, but not wanting to traumatize them at the same time or cause them to feel depressed?
Yeah, I mean, the trauma that, a lot of the conversations that were being had about critical race theory, and I was, just as an aside, so disappointed to hear Condoleezza Rice supporting this notion that we should not be discussing critical race theory. But, all of wars are traumatic. The Holocaust is traumatic. The Great Depression was traumatic for people who lived through it. But we talk about these things in a fact-based way that isn't emotional. It's just what happened. And so I think the biggest shame on this country was chattel slavery. They want us to forget that happened. Jewish people will not ever let you forget the Holocaust, and we should not. And I think it's the same thing with chattel slavery. It's just recognizing that we were a young country in comparison to the rest of the world, that we had some growing pains, that we made a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of things that were trial and error. There are things there are mistakes that we're still making today. But I think that becomes the hope in it, is stating these things as facts. These things occurred. There were Japanese internment camps. We don't get emotional about that as Black people. We just say, oh, those poor Japanese people were pulled out their house and put on camps. How long were they in those camps? That's a damn shame. But are we able to have those same conversations with our children about our own histories, about where our grandmothers came from and the resilience of our grandmothers? And I think the interesting thing for us as Black folks is Blackness is not a monolith. I know there are people in this conversation right now who have educated grandparents, whose grandmother was a teacher, whose grandparents went to Howard, whose grandparents were from the Caribbean, whose grandparents were doctors and lawyers and landowners. And so I think, as much as we talk about the negative things that have happened, there are so many wonderful things that have happened throughout the course of history for Black people, for women, for Native Americans, for marginalized people. So I think for me, in talking to children, it's talking about the facts of the things that didn't work out so well, the places where we really made a hard left and did not course correct fast enough, but also talking about the hope. And I think that goes back into that advocacy piece. Like, look, we haven't done all of the work. We have left plenty of work for you all to do. These are the things the opportunities that you will have as a result of all of these struggles.
And I would just add to that, I think you can make certain little minor tweaks to your language. I was impressed when I went on the field trip to the Atlanta History Center with my daughter a couple years ago, and she went to a predominantly white school. And when the presenter was talking about one of the former enslaved persons, he asked the question and the student raised his hand and said yes, because they were slaves, and the guy said no. That was an enslaved person. he would not allow them, that tour guide would not allow those white students to call those people who lived on that plantation slaves. And that was something that was so minor, but it made a difference. And I noticed that by the time we were leaving, those students were no longer using that term slave in the way in which they had, because that was almost demeaning and dehumanizing. That was a doctor, that was a lawyer, that was a homemaker, before they were pulled into slavery. And so I think you can make certain tweaks with respect to language that are subtle, right? So you're not going to offend that white parent, so to speak, who doesn't want their child to learn critical race theory, because most of them don't even know what that is. Let's be real clear about that. They don't even know what that is. It was politicized and they ran with it. And that's how, and again, people won elections. Look at what happened in Virginia. They won elections with that term, using that term. And but so you can make small changes to language, and then you can focus on the good things, that happened for us as a people. You know, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, and I grew up in a majority Black school, but we learned about Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and maybe certain aspects about who Malcolm X were. There are so many more people and more Black excellence that have, that we've seen in this country. We can focus on that, introducing these kids to some of these other individuals who did amazing things, who are continuing to do amazing things. And that's how, when you arm them with excellence, they will be excellent.
Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of being armed with information, both the positives and the negatives, and in terms of social media and its presentation that has impacted our levels of anxiety and our levels of comfort when we go out, all of this can become desensitizing to us. Where, as Sharice mentioned, over and over, we see these videos, and some of us have to say, I can't watch it anymore. Some of us see these videos and it becomes, our natural coping mechanism is we have to figure out how to normalize it in some way. And so sometimes we can see these videos over and over of individuals that are dying, and we become desensitized to the human component of that. How would you, or what would you suggest an individual do to get back to becoming more humane and human, and in reference to feeling and being empathetic to situations that they witness or hear about, to continue to tap into our common similarity of, we are all people that want to live and have a life where we can care for ourselves and our families?
So I'm gonna say,
go ahead, Trace.
go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say, as a Black woman, to be honest with you, and this is gonna be interesting, right? Because we're using Facebook as a platform to have this discussion. I had to learn, and I'm still learning, to be more intentional about how I interact with information on social media. And because think about it, you had that whistleblower at Facebook who blew the whistle, right? Fairly recently, that Facebook had data, and they knew that the way in which their algorithm worked was likely to cause harm to certain communities, Black communities in particular, around the election and around racial injustice issues, and young people. Around body image and things such as that, particularly their app Instagram. They knew that. They did nothing to course correct, but they continue to monetize. So social media, by design, has been monetizing off of racial stressors for Black folk. And so knowing that, because I know there are certain times when I just said, remark that, that white man said X, Y, and Z. And all of a sudden I'm muted for 24 hours. But I've seen white folk using the N-word with the hard ER. And they're not even getting muted. So how is the algorithm penalizing me for just pointing out that somebody is white and not even doing so in a derogatory manner? But I'm seeing individuals who are using racial slurs and the algorithm isn't picking that up. So I had to learn to be more intentional in terms of how I interact with social media. Certain websites that I used to frequent, I don't go to, or if I go to, I won't go into the comments. I don't go back and forth with trolls anymore. I'm not changing anyone's mind in a comment section on Facebook on some of those articles. And then I've had to, and I'm an introvert. Those of you who know me probably go like, what? But I'm an introvert to my core. And I had to realize that I had to start interacting with people again on a human level, connecting with people outside of social media, because, the pandemic made it so that we almost had to rely on social media for those of us who were there for interaction, because we couldn't gather together. And I've had to take it off of social media, schedule Zoom meetings with my friends to get together and discuss things and check in on each other, spending time with my children, putting electronics down, and just spending time checking in with them, seeing how things are going. Because even in middle school and high school, these kids were reacting to news of certain things, and dealing with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There were discussions that were happening even for them. And so I had to be more intentional about how I interact with social media and to start spending time with people again to get back to my humanity. And again, just to remind me what I do this for and who I do it for.
But I think also, when we talk about murders that are committed by people who have a badge, one of the conversations I've often had is why is it that those people are so afraid, and what is it about our culture that puts Black men in a position where they're seen as less than kind, less than generous, that they're viewed as mischievous. And I think continually having those conversations with Black men and boys about their humanity and about their ability to be vulnerable in safe spaces. And then the other thing that I've alluded to earlier is that I have lots of conversations with white people, some of which I know don't have the same education as me. And so I think entering into those conversations with a certain level of compassion, because some of their ignorance is their fault and some of their ignorance is not. But if they are willing to listen, if they are willing to learn, being able to point them in a different direction and offer them a different perspective. As Sharice mentioned, we may or may not change their minds, but I take every opportunity when I'm out with other people and engaging with other people to have those heartfelt connections, to look people in the eyes, to smile at people, to hold the door, to also tap into my own humanity, because it is very easy, particularly in these times, to stay within our bubbles. So where I have the opportunity is to step out of my comfort zone and have conversations with people who may not have the same views as me.
Thank you so very much to both of you for being here. This conversation has been extremely dynamic in all aspects related to race, related to politics, and of course, social media, and your mental health. I am going to put our QR code up. We have our co-chair, Dr. Janella Burse, who will share a final message, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. This was absolutely phenomenal. They said so much, yet we could continue to talk about this forever because this is the life we're living. Thank you so much. And I'm going to say it loud and proud. Dr. Tavari Brown, Attorney Sharice Michelle Reyes. There are no words for what you did tonight. Thank you so, so much. Also, thank you to our Mental Health Mondays chair, Dr. Nadia Barnett, our Physical Mental Health chair, Rashawn Mitchell Jefferson, and of course, our chapter president, Madam President Sabrina Clark. And most of all, to you, the audience, for joining us tonight. So what's next? January 17th, 2022, Triumph Over Tragedy. We will explore ways to continue living beyond loss, how to develop coping mechanisms by embracing healthy living and incorporate self-care. So thank you again so much, and we hope to see you in 2022.